Welcome to this screencast on terminology in the Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx population in the United States. This screencast is prepared for SWK 724. My name is Yvonne Ruiz. I am the professor for the summer course of 2021. So let's start with the term Hispanic. And you'll notice there is a question mark because this term is a little bit controversial, accepted by some, not accepted by others. So it's important to understand that the category of Hispanic was actually created in the 1970s by the U.S. Federal Office of Management and Budget. So Hispanic was a term that the U.S., I could say, imposed on the population in the U.S. And they operationalized the term as a person of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South America, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. I also want to mention that the term Hispanic usually refers to people with a Spanish language background. And this is important, as you will see in a moment when I talk about the term Latino or Latina. So in contrast, and as a response to the imposition of the term Hispanic, the term Latino was derived from Latin American. And this term was proposed as the term that best reflects the diversity of the national origins of Latinos in the United States. And Latino is operationalized as including all persons of Latin American origin or descent, irrespective of language, race, or culture. And here it's important to bring up that Brazilians are not identified as Hispanic because they do not speak Spanish. As we already know, they speak Portuguese. However, they reside in Latin America. Brazil is part of Latin America. So regardless of whether they speak Portuguese, they are included in the term Latino. And also, the term Latino specifically excludes individuals from Spain who are considered of Spanish national origin. As we know, Spain is in Europe. And I do believe that people from Spain consider themselves European rather than Latino. But however, the colonial history of South America and Mexico and Central America and many of the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Dominican Republic, were colonized by Spain. So there is a tremendous amount of Spanish influence in its, obviously, in its history, in its architecture, in the language, in the fact that the Spanish colonialists or Spanish conquistadores strove to erase any of the indigenous influences. They weren't able to erase all of it, and much of it still is important to identify, especially in South and Central America. But the colonialists imposed their way of life, their language, their values, traditions, and expectations and cultural norms on the all of the countries that speak Spanish. The terms Hispanic or Latino can be viewed as the heritage, the nationality, the lineage, or country of birth of the person whose parents or ancestors. So as I was saying, people who identify as Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish may be of any race. Their ancestors, their parents, or they themselves have been born in a country that is considered Latin American. And so the two terms, Hispanic and Latino, are sometimes used interchangeably, and they both refer to persons of Spanish-speaking origin or ancestry. Latino is more frequently used to refer generally to anyone of Latin American origin or ancestry, including Brazilians. Hispanic is a term that is more narrow in that it excludes Brazilians. It may also exclude other people from Latin American countries who speak an indigenous language and who identify as indigenous. So there are some differences between the two terms, even though they're used and commonly referred to as the same. Now, this slide, we move on to the terms Latino or Latina. So Latino is gender neutral term. In Spanish, the words that end in O are the terms that are used to refer to both masculine and feminine endings. So Latino refers to and includes anyone of Latino origin, regardless of gender or sex. So in Spanish, all collective terms, nouns, pronouns, adjectives, when used as a overall term, contains both sexes. So the masculine ending is privileged over the feminine ending. So Latino refers to both sexes, and some common spellings that neutralize the masculine influence include using Latino/Latina as a way of being inclusive. And sometimes you'll see the ampersand, the A contained in the O, as a way of also being inclusive. I still see both of these used. However, they seem to be falling out of favor a little bit. And the next slide is going to speak to that. So it's important to understand that many Latinos prefer to identify themselves by their countries of origin, by their national origin or heritage. So they may prefer identifying themselves through their nationality. I'm Mexican American, I'm Cuban American, I'm Puerto Rican American, Salvadoran American, etc. So that's the majority, 50%. Another 23% prefer to call themselves American. And another 23% describe using the terms as Hispanic or Latino. So again, this is an example of the diversity among the U.S. Latinx community population and how they self-identify. So best practices for us as social workers is simply to ask our clients how they prefer to be identified and let our clients tell us rather than using a label that may not be meaningful or may not be acceptable to them. And finally, we get to the term Latinx. And Latinx is the gender-neutral alternative to Latino, Latina, and it's the alternative also to Hispanic. Latinx has been adopted, especially by scholars. It was a term that was first used by LGBTQ plus activists. Now you'll hear it among journalists, and researchers are also increasingly using Latinx. And it's considered part of a linguistic revolution that is aiming to move beyond gender binaries, to be more inclusive of the intersectional identities of Latin American descendants. It is being used across Latin America, Central America, again, really by scholars, educators, and activists more than communities, but it is making some inroads. And in addition to men and women from all racial backgrounds, Latinx makes room for people who are trans, queer, agender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, all of these new terms that have arisen in the past few years as a way for people to get away from the kind of one-dimensional description of male or female. I also want to include the idea that Latinx is inclusive of race, it's inclusive of age, it's inclusive, as I said, of gender. So it really strives to be a term that can be adopted by anyone who wants to identify. So the last slide of this screencast ends with cultural terms, Hispanidad and Latinidad. Again, both are used interchangeably. Both refer to the same set of references, the various attributes that are shared by Latin American people and their descendants. So it is used by folks to identify cultural characteristics, to provide a way of pulling together a sense of cultural norms, behaviors, and values, and as a way of pulling together people from all of the various Latin American and Spanish-speaking countries under an umbrella related to culture. So it also includes cultural practices, the arts, painting, music, dance, and a lot of those aesthetic qualities that are considered to be part of Latin America and of Latinos in the US. It also includes, again, people of any race, legal status, social class, nationality, language. So it is a concept that's useful in thinking about the diverse culture and the diverse interests and cultural characteristics of Latinos. You may hear these terms, so I wanted to add these as part of the terminology. And with this slide, that concludes this screencast on Latinx terminology. Thank you for listening this far.